Welcome to the Good Faith Bible Studies podcast. I'm your host, Craig Nash, Senior Editor at Good Faith Media. Each episode, we explore and discuss the weekly texts and lessons found in Good Faith magazine. For the July, August, and September 2026 installment of the Bible Studies, I'll be inviting special guests to join me in sharing our thoughts and ideas about the passage and ways small groups might approach each week's lesson. We are glad you're here, so let's dive in. Today's passage comes from Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is it that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked of another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you've not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." Now, this is one of those out-of-the-blue parables called the parable of the dishonest manager. Perhaps you've seen it referred to as the parable of the shrewd manager. But it comes just after the parable of the lost sheep, coin, and the prodigal son. However, as I read this and looked a bit further to the verses that come after verse 13, which is what we read to today, it appears that Luke has structured this parable in a way that is kind of inverted from the way many of the other parables are structured. In previous parables, such as the parable of the foolish farmer or of the banquet guest that we've talked about in previous weeks, Jesus sees or hears or intuits the Pharisees thinking something, and then he launches into a parable to address what they are thinking. In this particular instance, though, Jesus tells a parable, and as Luke structures it, the parable is the setup to the Pharisees' thoughts and actions. In verse 14, which is just beyond what we read today, we're told that the Pharisees heard the parable and then ridiculed him. It seems that Luke, throughout his gospel, in various ways, is trying to hit home this idea that the Pharisees and Jesus seem to always have opposing views of what is appropriate behavior. Sometimes the Pharisees communicate these opposing views and Jesus launches into a parable. Sometimes Jesus launches into a parable and then the Pharisees grumble amongst themselves and say, this just isn't right. Now, my first impression of reading this parable this time around is not much different from what I imagine it was the first time I heard it as a child, which is, what in the world is Jesus trying to communicate here? It seems on the surface that Jesus is praising dishonest behavior. And now that I'm in a place in life where I'm not comfortable letting Jesus off the hook just because he's the Son of God and God incarnate, I think that I can say that Jesus is praising dishonest behavior here. but he's doing it in service to a higher purpose. One thing I noticed on this reading of the parable of the dishonest manager that I hadn't read before is this. Every time I've read this before, I had in my mind that the manager, for some reason, slashed what the debtors owed because he was trying to impress the landowner and to keep his job. I don't know why I thought that. It's not in the passage anywhere. And I also thought that the landowner was impressed because the manager had figured out a way to cut his losses and still return something to the landowner. But now I realize this isn't what's happening at all. None of that is in the passage. Instead, the landowner had already made the decision to fire the manager. The manager knew that and knew that he would need friends on the other side of unemployment just to survive. And so he went about making life much easier for the debtors so that they would think kindly about him when he needed them and would make life much easier on him. His decision wasn't motivated by profit. It was motivated by relationship. And I wonder if the landowner looked fondly on these actions because he saw the shrewdness in this relational move that he wished the manager had applied to his business moves. There are so many other angles from which we can look at this parable, a couple of which Sean Palmer has written about, which we will get to when we return after the break. Welcome back. Once again this week I am flying solo without a guest, and once again our curriculum writer for this lesson is Sean Palmer. Sean is the CEO of Sean Palmer Consulting, and he's the homiletician in residence at Bammel Church in Houston. Two things Sean mentions in this lesson that I want to highlight here. The first is this teaching from Amy Jill Levine, who's a Jewish scholar of the New Testament. She was also a 2025 Good Faith Magazine 25 Who Inspire, and she writes that even though the actions of the manager in the parable appear to be unethical, they are actually moving the ethics of lending in a direction that is closer to what was intended in the Torah, which focuses heavily on not exploiting the poor with high interest rates, and also offers up these opportunities such as the year of Jubilee when all their debts are forgiven. This teaching of Amy Jill Levine then helps further highlight what Luke was doing when he placed the Pharisees' grumbling and ridicule at the end of this parable. We often have this idea that the Pharisees were critical of Jesus because Jesus didn't stay close enough to the Old Testament law. But if what Dr. Levine says is true, and I believe it is, then this is yet another example of Jesus understanding the law far better than the Pharisees. The second thing that Sean points out here that is crucial to understanding this parable is the saying that Jesus has at the end, which probably is more well-known passage from the parable than the parable itself, which is this: you cannot serve both God and money. Sean notes that this is the key to interpreting this very confusing verse because in the story, Jesus is naming a rival god to Yahweh, which in the ancient world, this rival god was known as Mammon. Sean writes, "The God of Israel has always been the God who hears the cries of the oppressed and comes down to deliver. Mammon has always been the God who whispers that the suffering of the poor is their own fault, that the way things are is the way they must be. The two voices are not compatible." Now, for your group planning, there are some great suggestions we've placed in our leader's guide that you should have access to at goodfaithmedia.org. But if you're brave enough, I wonder if you'd be willing to do something else and ask the folks you were studying this passage with if they could come up with similar actions that a modern reader might consider that seem and may even be a little unethical, but which serves the greater purpose of advancing the kingdom of God. This may be an uncomfortable exercise, which would mirror the discomfort this parable causes us. But I think it could help stretch our hearts and minds in helpful ways. And with that, we will be back next week with another episode of Good Faith Bible Studies. I'm Craig Nash, and you've been listening to the Good Faith Bible Studies podcast from Good Faith Media. Our music comes from Pond 5. If you are not already a subscriber to Good Faith Magazine, learn more about how you can receive a copy of the magazine and Bible study curriculum at goodfaithmedia.org.